So today I want to talk to you about artificial intelligence and the impact that it's having on all of your lives. Some of it you may know about, some of it you may not know about, and how we can mitigate and govern the bias that we see in our day-to-day lives. So the question I have for everyone here is, does AI discriminate against women?
Yes.
Hey! Shocker. So one of the statistics that really got me into this in the first place was that men are 6 times more likely to receive targeted ads for higher paying and executive jobs than women. And I was like, hold on a second, I'm missing out on opportunities here that I don't even know I'm missing out on in the first place. You know, how is this fair? You probably might have seen this one in the news regarding Amazon, where they built a hiring AI that systematically discriminated against women. You could have something like women's chess club captain, CV, out, denied. And that was because it was built on past successful hires. Second shocker, they were all men. Therefore, how can we build an inclusive and diverse hiring system if it's based off past data where all the successful hires were from one category? So the second question, does AI discriminate against everyone? Yes? Not just women. So if we look at other categories, I wanted to start with women because obviously we're talking about International Women's Day. But if we look at this more generally, lenders have been found to charge up to 3.5% higher interest rates to minorities, which again is based on past data, but what does that have to do on your credit score and your credit rating? Shouldn't it be based on things like the age of your account and your ability to repay? Another thing to do with hiring is that people with European American names were 50% more likely to get a job interview than those with African American names, despite the CVs being completely identical. Again, inherent bias and discrimination. So the question I then ask is, well, why is this happening? And this is all down to something called bias. And unfortunately, it's an inherently human construct. We all have bias, we all have prejudice, and we all make cognitive shortcuts and assumptions to make decisions. That's just how we operate. The problem is that when we're trying to build artificial intelligence and sort of visualizing this from a human brain into an artificially intelligent system, we translate those biases. So we can define it as an unintended algorithmic preference derived from behaviors reflecting implicit prejudice, reflecting in unfair, illegal, or unethical implications. So the second problem this then says is, well, how do we translate human constructs into an artificially intelligent system? One of them that we can look at is fairness. Again, an inherently human concept. How do you tell a system what's fair and what's not fair? So I'm not going to go into any of this, but just to show you that when you're creating something that's human and translating it into a machine, you have to define what you mean by these constructs. Are we looking at including sensitive attributes? Are we excluding them? Does a counterfactual value replace the sensitive attribute? We have to now work at defining how we take human things and put them into an intelligent system. So today I wanted to briefly go over 4 different areas from where bias can stem from in the data sets. With all of you here who are programmers, you are all responsible for this issue. Algorithmic bias and black box AI. So if we start with dataset bias and we look at one of the tests that was conducted, a web crawler automatically indexed 840 billion words from the internet. Bearing in mind the internet is user-generated content. So conducting a word embedding association test that looks at how closely 2 words are linked together, it found that man is the programmer as woman is the homemaker. Again, we made this internet. This is where we're getting our training data from. Again, the picture of Google Translate into Turkish. We put in, he is a nurse, she is a doctor. Google Translate obviously is fed on training data from the internet that come out as she is a nurse, he is a doctor. Clearly, you can see here that the data sets that our systems are being based on, if they're being taken from the web, which is user-generated content, it's going to have inherent biases systemic from our past. So where else can we get data set bias from? Like I said, based on past data with the Amazon example, past hires. How old is our data? How public is it? Was it for your specific purpose of your project, or did it have a wider reach? How much diversity have you got in your data? How representative is it of today's population? How much data integrity do you have, and how accurate are your sources? And also, how much data do you have per sensitive attribute? An AI will make assumptions if it doesn't have enough data to make an informed decision. It will make assumptions based on the data that you have the most about. Predominantly, if we're going with gender, it will be male, especially for visual recognition, women of colour, something that AI isn't very good at recognising. Talking of that, IBM, not a shameless plug, but something that we're doing to combat this is creating a diversity in faces data set where we have created 1 million annotated human facial images just as a sort of starter for 10 to say, look, we're trying to create a data set that is representative of today's population and is diverse enough to ensure that we don't have these biases in our training data. So the second part we're going to have a look at is programmer bias. So within IBM, I have run a couple of workshops and they have all had the same output. I ask people, please draw me a shoe. No more context, just a shoe. Let's have a guess what we have here. So the men tend to draw trainers, suit shoes, whereas on the women's side, we have a whole array of things. Heels, pumps, sandals. But what this really illustrates to me every time is that if you have a programming group that isn't diverse, you're only going to get one worldview. You're only going to get one version of the truth. So how do you know that if you're creating an AI that detects shoes, if you've got a very narrow-minded programming group, they're not going to include attributes that would link to the heels or the pumps or the sandals. And this is very prevalent in a lot of systems that can't understand the small nuances between things like a wallet and a purse. Small things that you would only understand if you had that diverse development team. So cognitively, without us intentionally realizing it, we are embedding our own prejudice and assumptions and cognitive shortcuts into our artificially intelligent systems. To back this up, the UK, which is also responsible for this, because we have less than 10% of female software engineers, which is why I'm such an advocate for anyone who is interested in this industry to come together in one way or another so that we can have more diverse development teams and we can make sure that data is representative of the population of today. So then companies, when I tell them you need to be more ethical, they go, well, I don't care, it doesn't make me any more money. And I say, well, actually it can. If you're creating these hiring AIs, for example, which are inherently biased, if you don't have racial diversity, then you're not going to get higher financial returns by as much as 35%. Companies with below average diversity receive 73% less revenues from innovation. If that's not enough to show you why you need hire diverse people, but also make sure you have diverse development teams, then I'm not really sure what else you need, because at the end of the day, the bottom line is business. So the third category is algorithmic bias. Now, I wanted to illustrate this through an example of a CV. Typically, when you fire your CV into a hiring algorithm, they might be looking at all of these factors: race, age, sex, buzzwords, and all of that inherently will lead to a biased hiring decision. So a lot of companies come to me and they go, I've got a solution. I'll just get rid of the sensitive attributes and it will not be biased. It's not as easy as that. A lot of data that you'll find on a CV that you might not specifically be looking for, the AI will take into account. So for example, at the top here, you've got a rough address. The AI can then make inferences because it's designed to fit a regression curve, and whatever success principles you have defined for it, it will assume. So purely from your address alone, we can infer your ethnicity, because ethnic groups tend to congregate in different areas, so we know where you live. We can then infer your financial background. What kind of area do you live in? But then we can also rank that against the success of past hires. If past hires have all come from a certain area and been successful, the AI will then look at you as less successful if you come from an area that not many people have previously come from. Why should where you live be a disadvantage? No one cares. It's about you and your skills. Problem is that AI won't see it like that. So we have to make action now to be able to go, this isn't the only way to solve this problem. Excluding sensitive attributes isn't enough anymore. We need to make sure that we look for these small nuances and say, what else can an AI infer from something as simple as your address? So like I said, which variables are included in your decision making, but also how much are they weighted? To what extent did any variables constitute to a decision being made? So if we look at something like what's an open scale, we now have the ability to see which attributes contributed to a decision being made. So here we've got one for a loan being approved or denied, and you can see that the applicant's age, country, and account age were on the positive side and what weighting and percentage they had to a loan being approved versus their account balance and account status. Now, I'm not saying that these are correct. I don't know what country you're in would necessarily weight more than your account status, but you can see, just for argument's sake, how much this can have and how much further we can dig into a model to look at its integrity, accuracy, and ultimately transparency and accountability. So the final part I wanted to look at are black box AIs. A lot of AIs that were historically built, we can't dig into those. We are too far gone in a lot of senses because these models are so far advanced that they can write their own code. We haven't built transparency mechanisms in yet. So a lot of it is process re-engineering. We're working backwards to see where the bias stems from. So a simple picture of what a neural network could look like, if you see in the middle, no one has a clue what is going on in there. So it is our job to work backwards and say, where is the bias stemming from and why? What tools can we use, like deep visualization toolkits? We can look at these and go, in each layer of the neural network, which pixels light up? How does an AI know what is a difference between this pixel and this pixel? So to illustrate that, I have an AI here that categorizes trees. I ask it what these trees are. It tells me it's an elm tree, it's a pine tree, it's an elm tree, it's a pine tree. And I go, fantastic, it's so accurate. How does it know this? You would think, as a logical human, that it's looked at the bark, or it's looked at the color of the leaves, or it's got pine cones. The AI, unfortunately, knew the difference between an elm tree and a pine tree because of the birds in the branches. An AI is not a logical human. So this is just a way to visualize the fact that an AI will make an accurate decision on what we think is correct, but we need to test it to say, why is it making these decisions? What attributes constitute the output decision? Is it the branches and the bark, or is it that there's birds in the trees? And like I said, you can go through each layer of a neural network and see at which point do the pixels light up. I'd then be able to see it kept lighting up on the birds, and I would know that's how it constitutes its decision. We can then work through things like backpropagation to see, okay, how do we reverse engineer this and ensure that it understands the differences between the two trees? So to sort of sum up, why should we bother with AI ethics? This is a very scathing overview of some of the issues that we face, but AI has been called one of the greatest human rights challenges of the 21st century. If you're being discriminated against and can't get a loan, then this definitely is one. If we don't do something now, then we will continue to entrench societal prejudice even further in a sort of self-reinforcing feedback loop. As AI becomes more prevalent, it's still biased. That will entrench all of the new training data in our present day. And most of you here will have been affected by some form of AI on a daily basis. AI will also look to refine not only our society, but our businesses and our government. So realistically, if we don't act and provide some form of regulation now, we're going to be entrenching this further into our futures. So a final sort of word from me to not just the women here, but everyone involved in AI's creation or outputs is drive the conversation, work within your development teams, push for representativity, whether that be with your data or yourselves. Define success for everyone. Don't define success for what you believe it is. Define success within a system so that it is equal outcomes for everyone. Look at how you define fairness as a technical construct, not just a human one. And ensure that you have accountability and transparency built in throughout, because that is the only way that we can ensure procedural regularity and that we can monitor and audit these systems as we move forward. A very last final plug from me. I actually managed to get a paper published regarding governing AI bias in IBM Systems Journal. Yay, thank you. Thank you so much. This looks at building a maturity framework to go into an organization, give them all of the different tools and knowledge they need to mitigate bias right from the business offset, going, how do we put bias on the agenda? Is it in our strategy? Is it in our sprint development plan? Have we got a diverse development team? Right through to the data, the algorithm, and then at the end, looking at the testing and the accountability mechanisms. So if anyone's interested, please either message me on LinkedIn or find me tonight, and I can provide you with a copy if you wanted to read more. So thank you so much, everyone. You've been a fab audience, and have a good evening.